So I'm Robert Ristroph. I work here in Austin at Core Kitchens. I have some contact information up here. You can also just come and talk to me right afterwards. I have business cards and everything. These slides are kind of work in progress, but I'm gonna usually post them attached to our blog on our main site, so they will be posted. I can give you a copy of what I have now if you want right after. So a little bit about my history with regards to performance and so on. My original programming background was mostly in C and C++, with sort of high performance scientific type stuff like number crunching for image processing and stuff like that. And from that I got into helping some custom PHP applications that were sort of internal proprietary CMSs or other type applications that got really slow. This is back in the PHP 4 days. I would rewrite their core parts or make some sort of library out of their core parts and rewrite that into C and make that into a PHP extension in order to cut down on the amount of actual PHP parsing that's going on. And then from that kind of led to one thing to another. I guess that was around 2005 or 6, and since then I've kind of been in and out of performance stuff with PHP for a long time. And I ended up at Core Kitchens, which specializes mainly in very large Drupal websites. So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to kind of just talk about performance and scaling because it covers a lot of different things. Like there's making one site fast, there's being able to host a lot of sites at once, and then I'm going to kind of talk about what's sort of become sort of the standard server setup or whatever for big Drupal websites, and I think it's applies to a lot of other PHP applications as well. And then I'm going to kind of just throw out a bunch of stuff in there because a lot of the whole performance stuff is kind of like a big bag of tricks that aren't like, there's no, sometimes there's not much theory holding it all together. It's just a big bag of tricks and stuff. And kind of the wrap up as we go through this architecture and these tricks or whatever is a lot of these tricks just focus on actually getting the page out there using PHP and Drupal as little as possible, right? So a lot of it's just, a lot of it, sometimes it seems like you're actually kind of evading PHP and Drupal in a lot of ways. This has kind of some notes to myself about the whole issue of scaling and performance. You can look at there's a number of different things you can look at. Typically people look at the page load time for a single page request, right? And that usually goes in the name of performance. You're getting the site to generate a page and kick it back as fast as possible. And that's usually the first thing that people end up looking at. However, if your site gets big in traffic, you end up thinking much more about concurrency of how many pages can you generate at the same time. And you may be willing to let all of your pages be 1/10 of a second longer to generate if you can do 400 of them at once instead of 200. And so there's kind of some different directions you can go in there. Usually most things you're doing that make something more efficient are going to affect both. But things that involve some type of blocking action, like database table locking and so on, you can do things that make loading a single request very fast, but limit the number you can do at once. There's also a lot of differences in the type of traffic that you're serving. If you have a blog on a sports-related subject and you expect that, well, after a big game you're going to get a spike in traffic, right? That most of that traffic will be not logged in traffic that is very cacheable, and that every page should appear exactly to the same person. And that is sort of a much easier scaling problem to handle than one where you're expecting a flood of comments, where people will be logged in and they'll also be expecting the page to be different right after each comment. The more complex one involves a lot of database rights and usually ends up being database blocked. The anonymous one can often, whether it's WordPress or Drupal or anything else, be handled by a reverse proxy on the front end, like such as Varnish. And and so the anonymous versus logged in is kind of the same thing as user-created content versus read-only, and almost all the hard problems are with user-created content. How fast do you want that to update? Like if one person posts a comment, can other people not see that comment for 5 minutes or whatever, or something like that? Like what's acceptable there? And that's where a lot of the hard problems are. And in the end, you kind of need to be able to tweak systems for different things. A framework like Drupal is used for a lot of different kinds of websites. You know, people used to say WordPress is just for blogs, and then like gradually it's becoming more and more kind of for all kinds of sorts of things. And Drupal was always there in terms of being sort of a framework that was used for all sorts of absurd things. I've heard people talking about accounting systems that use Drupal on a point of sale and things like that. And so you really need to understand the system and be able to tweak it to be able to do different things. And then one key is, I think, with regard to performance, is that often people come and say, my website has gotten slow, but they haven't been keeping any numbers or have any saved performance things from the past, so you don't really know. It's very possible that their standards have just risen, which is probably a good thing, but that could send you off on a wild goose chase of looking for something that has some log file that has gotten too big, or you're looking for something that's changed when in fact nothing has changed. For running very big websites like the sites for big print magazines and so on, you almost always want to be regularly collecting and logging performance numbers with some sort of automated system like Jenkins. So you don't just you're not in the position of saying it feels slow. You know it's slow, and you know it was slow when we rolled out feature X, and you can focus on specific things. So this page kind of covers a lot of stuff that's kind of about the state of Drupal right now. I wasn't sure how to get into this because I don't know how much you guys are familiar or care about that as opposed to just PHP stuff. Drupal, as like from Drupal 6 or whatever, has pretty good, most of the code is pretty good from a PHP standards point of view. With Drupal 7, it now has like kind of a wrapper around the standard way of caching something with a static variable. And kind of some good best practices examples regarding that. And especially in core, but also for, like if you go to the Drupal usage page and look at the top 100 most popular modules and so on that aren't in core, the quality of the community input is pretty high. Most of the people who are getting code in there are it's being sort of code reviewed by the community, and it's pretty up to snuff as far as like PHP coding standards go. But the key is Drupal is supposed to be extremely flexible and have this extremely very powerful plugin system and different themes and all that. And as the community makes architecture decisions, the flexibility and power generally slightly edge out performance. Most of the user base of Drupal aren't running up against performance problems. They have the perception that next year computers will be faster, and they'd rather have a cleaner way to do some kind of plugin and save themselves programming time than have someone explain to me, like, them an arcane reason why this is slightly slower and why they have to learn something new. As a result, Drupal 7, as compared to Drupal 6, uses more memory as its memory footprint. It is, in terms of page generation time, it's slower on the first page loads when it's sort of filling its caches. After that, I think it's a little bit faster, although that's a very vague, hand-waving thing to say given the number of different things that Drupal can do. I'm sure there's some things that are slower. But it has gotten like more weightier and seems to require more infrastructure to support. I know some of the Drupal hosting places, Hot Drupal based in North Carolina, I talked to one of the technical guys there. They had to increase the amount of memory across all their VPSs for the Drupal sites. And that directly impacts how many customers they can put on each server. And directly hits their bottom line. And I think going forward, I have this suspicion that sort of controlling the size of memory issue will be like a thing going forward. And so these are, we mentioned Pressflow, which one of the founders of 4Kitchens was one of the people that started that. That is a open source project, and it's not controlled by 4Kitchens, and not all of the main contributors even work there anymore. It is on GitHub. It is for Pressflow 6. It's a fork of Drupal 6 that threw out a lot of things, such as compatibility with Postgres and things like that, and changed a few things about how it does cookies to make it work with Varnish or for front-end cache. And if you want to run a fast Drupal 6 site, you are almost surely running Pressflow. That's what a lot of the big websites like theeconomist.com and so on that are on Drupal 6 are using. But it's a little bit inaccurate to call it a fork, because it maintains API compatibility, so any module that will drop in will still work. There's optimizations that have been rejected to hold true to that. And it maintains releases in tracks, so within a couple of days of anything being released for Drupal 6, the equivalent things are ported over to Pressflow 6. One interesting thing that's happening in the Drupal community that is sort of cutting edge, I think, in terms of big systems together, is that people are looking at various automated performance testing systems, so that for Drupal core, every time a patch went into master, some series of tests would run off some test suite and confirm how it was impacting performance. And right now, the only part of that that's working, it's not on the official Drupal.org infrastructure, is some people have some things that run all the standard tests that run anyway, the simple tests and unit tests and so on. But they run them with XHProf enabled and collect that call tree information. How many people here know what XHProf is? Maybe I should explain that. Okay, good. I'm glad a few people know about it. It's a product it's a profiler that was done by Facebook for their PHP code, and you can turn it on like you turn on Xdebug by setting a flag, a little thing in your php.ini. It's much more lightweight than Xdebug. Xdebug will slow your site down while it's on, and can be to where you can't run it on some production sites that have too much traffic. XHProf you can generally leave on, and Drupal has an XHProf module you can use for debugging. So you can go to a particular page, turn XHProf on, and it'll give you a link down at the bottom, which will show you the call graph and where computation time was spent and what functions for making that particular page. And so what we want to do is make it so every time make some change in the code, something goes and automatically runs a bunch of this, collects those numbers, and looks at the differences from before and after. And that's very pie in the sky. I don't know to what extent it will ever be worth the overhead of maintaining it, keeping it working. But for some portions of it, it almost surely will be. Eventually, something like that will be used in Drupal core. Okay, so I think I already covered all this. This is about Pressflow. I guess two things I should mention is normally for most of the websites out there, if you're slow, you're handling a lot of traffic. Most of your traffic is anonymous, and the single biggest silver bullet bang for the buck you can do is install install Varnish or some other reverse proxy cache in front of your system, so that if someone's requested, different people are requesting the same page, it just gets reserved up to the amount of memory, and your PHP code never even sees that request. This has impact if you collect logs and things like that from inside PHP. Pressflow has a tweak in it that allows that to work correctly with Drupal. The original Drupal 6 set a session cookie even if you weren't logged in. And that session cookie was different, and that broke the Varnish cache, and Pressflow has a little tweak to allow that, and that's like the single biggest thing. I mean, I would say 98% of you in here, if you run into a server crashing from load, being able to install a reverse proxy like Varnish will solve your problems. There is sort of a Pressflow branch on the Drupal 7 thing, but Drupal 7 is sort of, most of the changes that were done in Drupal 6 were pulled into Drupal 7, and we also kind of have a better way of re-architecting stuff. We have a Drupal 8 that's much more interactive development, so when we have new ideas that we can't get into Drupal 7, we still have a good way of trying them. So there's just there's just one small change in the Pressflow 7. It's probably not worth you installing it unless you need that particular thing. And it deals with handling settings.php on the config files for Drupal on systems that automatically deploy from something like GitHub. So it's like a kind of an arcane thing. But if there were tweaks that couldn't go into Drupal 7, they'll be accumulated there. So here, what I want to do is, this gets a little bit, I'm going to try to show some diagrams of the components of a, I'm not sure, well, that's pretty good, I guess. This is obviously, I drew this diagram, as you can tell by its quality. This is sort of the setup of running Drupal on one server as fast as possible. It's like, what is the state of the art now? This is on one server. So you have the internet, and this is, all these components are sort of running on the same server. And you have Varnish, which is what listens on port 8080. And so 98% of the traffic it will return, and it's in RAM. And then this line here, which you might be able to read, says only non-anonymous traffic. So only logged in people ever hit the Apache and are actually computed in PHP. And this box kind of represents where PHP itself is. I put Apache or Nginx in there because I think the state of the art is changing from Apache to Nginx with PHP FPL. And then I put a little sub box in there for the APC opcode cache. And I won't repeat much of what Dan said, but you pretty much need to have it on there. I think I have in some of my follow-on slides, I think the APC project itself in PHP has a very small number of contributors, and I suspect that it could be improved a lot if we took some of the fancy things that people have done in Java, JVMs, and just-in-time compilers or whatever, and maybe tried some of the low-hanging fruit there in APC. And I also kind of worry, because it looks like there's so few people working on that, that like some really bad bug could get in there and no one would know the code enough to kind of track it down or whatever. So if you're interested in that type of code and looking for an open source project to work on or whatever, that you might check that out. So this is your actual web server running. And as much as possible, before it has to go to this, which represents the database, the system we set up to grab from a memcache, which is another separate process running in RAM, kind of like Varnish, where you can cache some things. And the types of things that are cached in there are usually pages, fully rendered blocks, so there'll be a chunk of whole HTML that represents like, favorite comments on the site or something like that changes on the side, that type of thing. And I put memcache or Redis because just as Nginx seems to be kind of replacing Apache as the new hotness and being a little bit faster, Redis also seems to be replacing memcache. And everyone understands memcache very well and they kind of like it. So and Redis has some new aspects to it, but and of course you have to test it under a lot of different usage conditions to confirm this, but the people have sort of have benchmarked or whatever says in the way that Drupal uses caching systems, it does seem to be faster. And then I drew a diagonal line through the hard disk icon because this will hold both the files, like all the assets, like people upload PDFs into the website or their icon pictures, and the SQL database. And that has the potential that anything going on here can slow down the whole machine. And that is kind of and for something like almost 3 years, that's sort of been solidified as sort of the standard Drupal setup. And if you look at some of the things people do with other big PHP applications, it's kind of the same setup, roughly the same. So if you get much bigger than that, you go to clusters. Where is my other picture? Yes, let me just cover up that one. It's okay that you can't see the bottom there. There's nothing there. So this is where that same machine has been the single machine we have seen before. We've made 2 copies of it. So it still has Varnish, and it has the Memcache on the same machine, and Apache Nginx with APC. The big thing we did is we moved the database off of that, right? And I show a replicated database. So there's MySQL slave master replication, and that means that these Drupals need to know that when they're doing a write SQL query, like an update, it has to go to the master. They can't do that on the slave. And they also need to know that certain queries that are very timely, like they're reading something that might have just changed, they should probably do those on the master anyway. And Pressflow 6 has a bunch of changes that allow that Drupal 6 did not, and Drupal 7 has them in there by default. This DNS round robin or other basic load balancing, on a lot of the servers I set up, I actually do that in Varnish, because in Varnish you can configure it to kick traffic back and forth to each other. And then one of the things that you'll notice about this is there's a lot of arrows going back and forth between all the parts of this cluster. So if these machines aren't connected very well with fast Ethernet cards, that can become the bottleneck. So typically when setting this up, I mean, usually it's set up in a data center with Dell servers that have 4 Ethernet cards built in on the motherboard and so on. So you can make all these connections very well, or you have a really good switch. Working with some people, they kind of have like a homegrown cluster thing, and everything just has one Ethernet wire running into it, and it's all running into one big switch that also handles their whole office and people watching YouTube and everything. That usually won't work. You have to add additional Ethernet cards to each one of these machines and make sure they have the fastest connections to each other. It does actually make a lot of difference, especially once you go and start hand tuning stuff to make sure as much as possible is stored in the Memcache, because that traffic goes back and forth to each other. I think one of the comments that Dan made was about cache consistency, and he was referring to APC and how you couldn't use APC as the cache once you had more than one server, because APC runs on each one of these things and it doesn't talk back and forth to each other. So if this guy sees you log in and sticks your session cache in APC, and then your next web request hits this guy and look in this APC, your session will be there and you'll tell you you're logged out. It has to put you in this Memcache, and the Memcache client in PHP has a way of knowing that this particular key, I should look first on this, then on this machine for where it should be. And it's nice in that setup that if one of the Memcache crashes, it falls back to the other one, which is kind of necessary, because usually if you're getting 4 machines, you kind of want the high availability thing. You want to make sure that you can lose a couple of these things and not have the site completely go down. And so then I have one more drawing, which is just sort of more and worse of the same. I don't think it's quite going to fit. But essentially, people just start replicating that web server out horizontally. So this arrow indicates that you can just keep replicating web servers horizontally. So the bottleneck won't be PHP, because you can always add more servers. By the time you have people doing this, they have money. You can also add Varnish servers, or more likely, by the time you have people who are this rich, they are using a big IP F5 type thing to do all that stuff, and that's really good. I do need to move this up somehow. Well, maybe, yeah. Well, there's a little bit being chopped off the bottom here, but basically down here, you see all the crazy arrows. There's memcaches broken off on separate machines, and there's a problem that you can't really expand the databases out sideways as far as you want, because you can add more slaves, but all the writes still have to go to that one master. And so once you've got so many writes charging in, say you're running a site like Reddit, people are voting up and down. Once the right traffic exceeds what the biggest server you can buy can handle with MySQL, then you're kind of done. You can't scale with MySQL any further. And that feeds back into what I was saying before, where user-generated content and a database bottleneck, as you get into really huge sites, that's usually the place. So I'll leave this up on my laptop so you can see the whole thing, and we can take a look at that afterwards. Let's see, I'll switch back to the slideshow. And how am I on time? Okay, I'm going to blast through a couple of things here. These are kind of I'm going to list the things that are kind of the cutting edge, and those diagrams I showed are sort of like the state of the art and become the standard Drupal, big Drupal setup. These are things that people are kind of experimenting with now that are kind of the cutting edge. You know, if you want to give talks at Drupal camps and so on, pretty much any one of these buzzwords and experimenting with them will get you invited to talk. And because it's new, you don't have to have all the answers. You can just give a talk where you say, hey, I tried this out and it didn't work. So there's this thing called ESI, or Edge Side Includes, and that is where in your HTML you sort of have some tags and you say, this is custom content, go and get this block on the side from Drupal, but everything before and after it you can pull from Varnish. And then you have Varnish kind of cat several chunks of the page together to make the page. That's, and being able to do it so people can build pages in Drupal with that is something that there are a couple of different modules to do and so on. That's kind of hot. Nginx instead of PHP is kind of becoming the new thing. And in particular, people have benchmarked Nginx's front-end cache, and it seems to be faster than Varnish's by some percentage. The problem is that Varnish has a very nice language of being able to specify what cookies to ignore and what cookies to listen to for how you cache, put little things in there so you can cache pages in different languages differently if you have a multilingual site and all that. And people know how to use this very well in Varnish. And Nginx, it's not really there. So that's kind of a thing. I mentioned Redis instead of Memcache. I put NoSQL here, and basically any site that has a ton of stuff, making it so those votes, when they come in on a Reddit-style site, that they get stuck into something like MongoDB or Cassandra, or even just in a Memcache, and then something later kind of as a background task comes behind, adds them up, and puts the aggregate stuff in MySQL, is kind of something that people are running into, and that's kind of an area of really interesting stuff. In general, all big websites, I think, are going more towards having lots of services where little chunks of the website are really just provided by chunks of JSON or XML that are then interpreted or templated or redisplayed. And that means that inside Drupal we have this big movement in the community to make it so each individual different content type or the list of users and all that kind of stuff, everything internally, like there's some way you can just click and say expose this at this URL as some sort of JSON REST interface or some other kind of interface. A lot of the stuff that I have done involves taking things like indexing for search and so on, and somehow pulling that out of the web server entirely. Drush is a command line PHP CLI interface to Drupal. So you can do Drush something and it will do the same computation or some set of the same computation that would run on a web request. And pulling stuff out of that, so Drush commands on a completely separate machine can sort of process aggregation and stuff and keep stuff off the web servers has become a big technique for some things. And kind of fitting into the services thing, a lot of things like PubHub, SubHub, and feeds and stuff like that, people have kind of been pulling out of Drupal and using Node.js to serve, and on the back end, like maybe having Node.js fetch a single copy from some Drupal or something and aggregate it or something like that. And I mentioned the automated performance testing. I think a lot of the really big, high infrastructure websites are going towards that and wanting people to set up that kind of stuff. So this is this stuff, this architecture is more of a matrix of servers. And I mentioned Heroku, Pantheon. I put OpenShift with a question mark by it because I'm not sure what OpenShift actually does. it's a Red Hat product that I learned about only recently. But more and more people are giving up a little bit in terms of the total speed time of the page in order to be able to handle a lot of pages at once. And the way they're doing this is using these systemd and cgroup things to have a lot of Nginx servers kind of in their own like separate little compartmentalized boxes. And they have a ton of these spread out across a bunch of servers. And they may have 1 or 16 or something, or one per core on each server or something like that. And that's kind of a and then to do that, usually you completely split off the cache systems and everything else off of that matrix type thing. And that seems to be something that a lot of people who are doing huge stuff are moving towards. It's a very sort of big infrastructure type thing. I mean, I don't think any individuals are setting up stuff like that. Just kind of big infrastructure type places. And okay, so this is the last slide. I'll talk fast. So kind of for the future, I think Drupal, like a lot of projects, has gotten to where it needs automated performance testing. There are a lot of open source projects that do. The big problems are always write load when you have a bunch of user-generated content coming down there. And I had Cassandra in there because I know of someone who has used this Cassandra NoSQL DB to collect the voting API information on a Drupal site. And then getting back to the whole theme of this group, I still think there's some stuff inside PHP we could do. I think with the newer versions of PHP, maybe just in the size of the data structures, if we could reduce that so we didn't have the 14 bytes per array element type thing, code might shift in and out of the various caches on the CPU a lot faster.
Or you could just compile it into C, like Facebook does.
Yeah, the Facebook hip hop stuff seems to be like only twice as fast, which means that either APC is actually really good, or that hip hop isn't very good. I know that for PHP 4, if you just take straight PHP code, rewrite it into C by essentially just removing the $ and adding types, you should expect to speed up beginning with like 100 times or something, like really fast. And then on the database end, I've also, Postgres was kind of like shuffled off to the side because it didn't have replication for a year or so there, but I've been noticing on various blog posts and stuff, well, they have replication now, and in addition, I've been for one server, it's always been slightly fast. I think the newest versions may have some faster stuff. So especially for like the one server version where you're doing as fast as Drupal as you can on one server, it might be time to kind of go back and really look at Postgres and relearn how to tune that really well. I think that's it. Do you have time for a couple of questions, or should I just wait till the end?
Let's wrap it up and then
Okay.
questions. All right.
Hit me with questions after.